Well, I'm here with Alexander Beiner, who is one of the founders of Rebel Wisdom, and he wrote an article on July 17th on Medium called Sleeping Woke, Cancel Culture and Simulated Religion, which got a lot of play on the social media circles that I'm a part of, and wanted to have him on just to have a little discussion about it. How you doing, Alexander?
I'm really well, thank you. Yeah, how are you doing, David?
I'm doing great. And my background, my podcast is called Things Hidden, and it's kind of a deep dive into anthropology, and we look at headlines, and then we go back into mythology, and we look at rituals, and we look at the patterns that we see replaying in history to give people kind of the way I say it is like a secret tool in the back of your back pocket that you can pull out as a kind of guide to understanding the craziness that we seem to be in. But of course, what you guys do at Rebel Wisdom is very similar. You guys are bringing in systems thinkers, and you're bringing in folks that don't really have any easy categorization on the left-right paradigm, and you're trying to help usher in a conversation by leading by example, right?
Yeah, that's I think a really nice way to put it. And I love the name of your podcast because I think, you know, looking at what is not immediately obvious, but what is under the surface and playing out through the culture is really key to what we're doing. And I think of it a little bit like trying to diagnose an illness purely by looking at the symptoms. You know, if we look at what's playing out, what people are saying, the content of what they're saying, while important, is really just, I think, often a reflection of, I suppose you could say, the memes that they're carrying and what's coming through them. And so to look at that deeper level, and mythopoetics is a level we look at a lot. Systems theory, you mentioned, to use one of Jordan Hall's phrases, the deep code of culture. Peter Lindbergh's work on mimetic tribes, there's Nora Bateson as well, on how systems learn. There's so many different angles to look at that all do kind of, we're on a similar mission, right? To try to
Right.
figure out what is happening under the surface, and what tools do we need to make sense of that, and it's an ongoing process to figure out what those tools are, from practices to understanding our cognition to learning how to use our language carefully. The list is continuously growing, and I think there's a tremendous amount of energy right now for people to find new ways to make sense of the world and new ways to see what seems chaotic and what is chaotic, the cultural landscape we're in, and figure out basically what is going on.
Yeah. So, what is the most enjoyable part of your work and with Rebel Wisdom and what you guys are doing? What have you enjoyed the most out of it?
That's a good question. I mean, there's been certain like interviews and interactions which I've enjoyed a lot. I think a lot of my focus is on, as well as the writing side of what we do, is on our live experiences and events. And one of the things we've been doing for the last couple of years, and we're trying to do, because it's not that easy, is how do you get people together to effectively do that mimetic mediation, to look at what are the polarities playing up in our culture, and is there a way to drop beneath that level into, going into understanding the science and psychology of polarization, understanding how we react biologically and psychologically when we feel threatened, and how that changes our cognition. And so doing that kind of work, and seeing what happens, feels for me is one of the most exciting things. And probably one of the most enjoyable things is seeing just how much appetite there is for people to do that, like all the time. One example, we did a collective intelligence lab. About this time last year, we were doing a series on collective intelligence, which is maybe a concept you're probably familiar with. This idea that no one knows how to build an airplane. No one person knows how to build an airplane, right? We have to have some way of coming together, coming into some sort of cohesion with each other. And when we do that in the right way, new insights emerge between us. But that's kind of easier said than done, because that requires a certain level of presence, a certain level of being able to have a kind of agency over ourselves as things are coming up, and we have to listen in a certain way. We have to know how to use language. But when we do that, even the attempt to do that is fascinating. And I think that's really, like, right now, partly the cutting edge of where we could go as a culture in a direction that takes us away from all this tribalized politics. And I read up a little bit on Rene Girard's work, and that kind of dynamic of the scapegoat and etc. All those kind of patterns playing out over and over. How do we get out of those patterns? How do we acknowledge them and then take a step back from them and be able to create something new? So I think that's always exciting when it happens in person or on a Zoom call. We do a lot of kind of online events as well.
So, people like Brett Weinstein have suggested that perhaps maybe we need to create a new replacement for religion. What do you think of that? Some kind of new force that can bind people together, that can unify the appetites that we see spilling out into political conversations.
Yeah, I I both kind of agree and disagree, because I think that is a religion. Why not have religion? And I think Brett and I would probably have different perspectives on the metaphysical. I know Brett is a scientist and a biologist. I've actually, talked to him briefly about this as well. Like, for me, without the metaphysical core of transcendence and something beyond our own egos that binds us and connects us to an actual metaphysical reality, which I believe there is. I just do. I don't think it's going to cut the mustard. I don't think it's going to be that effective. And for example, Alain de Botton here in the UK has created the School of Life. And the School of Life is sort of an atheist approach to religion. It's kind of religion for people who don't want to have a religion. And I've engaged with some of their stuff and kind of looked into it, and it's all very nice, and I think it's very well intended. But what it lacks is that sacred fire, let's say, that kind of core of that very deep core that makes religion one of the only things that will make someone willing to sacrifice their own life for someone else, for example. If it doesn't have that, right, I don't think it's really strong enough to meet the challenges we're facing. So I don't have an answer to what it is we need, but I think we need to fill the God-shaped hole in our world. What fills it? I don't know. Is it a religion? Is it something like a religion? I'm not entirely sure. But I think it has to. I think we can't shy away from what religion is, to replace it.
Yeah, and I'm a Christian, so I try to treat in my work, I try to approach the teachings of Jesus as if you can engage that without having to accept all the metaphysical claims, just engaging it on an imitation basis, right? With mimetic theory, the idea that we all have to have role models, right? So if we have role models, and one of the things about Christianity with Jesus is that it's coming to an epistemological humility where you can recognize that you have role models and you will never not have role models, right? And so when you say, well, you're going to follow Jesus, well, I don't need Jesus. I'm very fine on myself. I am a sovereign individual. You don't realize how religious you are at that moment, how much other people's role models have got their hooks in you, and they have shaped the desires and the language and the posturing and the social status and all the things that you're trying to present, that those are all mediated through role models that you are in awe of, right? And that's where we get the idea of worship. Worship is just a word that means basically to be in awe of someone and to want to imitate them, right? And so, that's kind of where we're coming from a mimetic anthropological standpoint. And I think you're right that you do have to have something bigger than just, say, a brotherhood of man if you want people to get along, because if there's nothing outside of our subjective experiences, as we see with the rise of the wokeism, as you call it, a type of religion, that's a scary place because, if there's nothing outside of us transcendent, it's just power after power. Whoever's got the power is the one who can then use that power to subjugate people through social pressure and, force with the state and so on.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And another aspect to it, I think, when you don't have that, let's say, you just have that brotherhood of man and there's nothing higher than humans, then I think the other, the results are what you're talking about. And there's also a very deep narcissism that comes with that. There's no humility, and I think humility and, you use the word awe. We had a a session with John Vervaeke, who was delivering a session on our online course recently, and we talk a lot about curiosity, so coming from a place of not knowing, as we're trying to make sense of things, being really key for various, well, psychobiological reasons, but also just from an attitude standpoint of like, we don't know everything. And he pointed out that an even better word than curiosity is wonder, and so when you said, oh, I thought, yeah, like, I was just reminded of that the capacity of wonder and mystery as well.
Right.
There's something humbling about, deeply humbling, whether it's mimetically or spiritually, about Christ. Like, there's just something deeply humbling about that experience, and that, and you don't get that in wokeism, because there is only the kind of the language game that can never end, because there's nothing to sort of rejuvenate it. Jung talked about the necessity of sort of, we have our egos in this kind of limited perspective, and they need to be refreshed and rejuvenated by a connection to the self, this kind of deeper soul level of us. And if that doesn't happen, we kind of go crazy. We go into a certain type of madness. And I think, from my perspective, wokeism, which I define as sort of the mimetic and like simulated religious expression that we're seeing play out in culture, it's distinct from legitimate concerns about power and oppression. Like, there are many legitimate concerns around that. It's a distinct thing. I think it uses that, but it becomes its own entity. And I think the reason I wrote the article is because I was feeling like, having been covering this stuff for a couple of years, it feels very different right now, what's happening. It feels very much more like it's come into its own, it's metastasized into its own entity, where now even a lot of people on the political left are going, whoa, I'm not sure this is really the value system I hold. In fact, I don't hold this value system. And that was what the Harper's letter was about, the letter signed by 150 odd sort of mainly writers and kind of artists, I suppose, and commentators, saying like, we need the freedom to say things that people might find offensive, to put it really bluntly.
Right.
And that is and what it was met by was really this kind of rigid response, which is common to the kind of the wokeism as a religion, this kind of rigid circular response saying, yeah, but that letter was signed by people who I disagree with. And it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the point of the letter. It's like, and also the argument that cancel culture doesn't exist is very common, and when I was researching the article, I spoke to a few people who I suppose would identify themselves as social justice activists, and I've spent a lot of time doing that. And their response was, cancel culture doesn't exist. No one's being canceled. People are saying things that are completely unacceptable, and we are calling them out. Right? There's a righteousness to it, like a real righteousness. We're calling them out for those unacceptable things. And then anytime I would ask, who decides? Where's the value system at play to decide what's acceptable, what's unacceptable? And what's fascinating to me is that the response was, well, that's obvious. I mean, that's common sense. And that for me is similar to a religious answer, in that it's a moral answer. Like, and in the article, I talked about Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations. It's a moral answer around, there's a few things going on. It's around conceptions of moral fairness and purity, like sanctity. And there's no real sense of curiosity or wonder or, how interesting. Yes. Where am I coming from when I say that? It's just this like rigid certainty, And so then a lot of people have commented on the similarity between Puritanism, a kind of Puritanism, but where wokeism, I think, is not really a religion, but a simulated religion, is that it mimics all these qualities. It has care for people. It has it sort of has rituals of kind of public shaming, but it has no real center, and it has no core, no sort of core beyond itself. So it's kind of a narcissistic expression, I think.
Well, I think I can explain why that is. I could give a sketch maybe. So first, there are some critical connections between the foundations of wokeism and Christianity at its very fundamental core. When you think about social construct theory, their premise is that language constructs reality, right? And I think that that's from Christianity. In the beginning was the Word,
Mm,
right? So the question is, what is that language? Is that language imbued by violence or love? Now, the Christian answer is that the word that is spoken into existence that makes the universe what it is today, that is sustaining it with every vibration of that word, that love, that word is true love,
mm,
unconditional love, and that word exists in a relationship in which there's three in one, the idea of three persons in one, almost like a family or something,
mm,
but the idea being that they're fully one but also in society at the same time, so they know what love is prior to our existence. So that's the idea, is that within the word, within God itself, within the Godhead itself, you have a society of mutual, unconditional, mimetic love.
mm,
And from that foundation point, the universe is made in that image. And it's in that we, in particularly in Earth, are made to be the full picture, the fullest picture in the image of that loving relationship, that familial structure of unconditional reciprocal love. Now,
mm,
the critical theory folks, they also believe that in the beginning was the word, but they believe that that word is a form of violence and that language is warfare. And so that's their foundation. And so one is, and so that changes everything. When you believe that the universe is built on a kind of a game of violence, you're in Nietzsche's world, right? And Nietzsche predicted this. Nietzsche would call what is going on in the wokeism, he would call that a continuation of the degradation of the old religion, the old way of doing things that Christianity unleashed, that he would call it slave morality or resentment,
mm,
right? And that's really what's going on here. So when you mention that it has the form of religion, but it can't be grounded in anything, I would say that's because from an anthropological standpoint, Christianity destroyed religion. It destroyed the ancient and the placenta of our humanity, which was the sacred. It destroyed the ability to unify around a common enemy or a common scapegoat that we could all truly believe was guilty and deserving of being excluded or murdered or eaten in the earliest stages of humanity, right? With ritual
mm,
cannibalism. So when you mentioned you mentioned that when you talk about the woke folks, that they can't admit that they are doing anything like canceling, right? And Rene Girard says that to scapegoat is to not know you have a scapegoat, right? So it's that misrecognition of what you're doing, which is key for the perpetuation of a scapegoat phenomenon to occur. We're never cognizant of when we're scapegoat. Every time we channel our shame or our bad feelings and cast them onto somebody else, we're not aware we're doing it. And that's why it feels so good. That's why it feels so right. Because we're always convinced that everybody else scapegoats around us, but that our true villains are truly villains, right? And that's what Christianity is trying to get us to wake up from. And
mm,
as it continues to deconstruct that sacred space and waken us up to the fact that we are scapegoating, you're going to create these kind of mad imitations of Christianity like wokeism, which are scapegoating in the name of defending scapegoats,
yeah,
right?
that's great. That's great. Yeah, I think that's a really useful way to see it. I mean, what it reminds me of as you're talking is the shadow. You familiar with the kind of the Jungian concept of the shadow and
Yeah.
the way that plays out? I mean, it's very similar to what Gerard is talking about. Like, um, I think he's taken quite a sophisticated kind of mimetic view of it. And but that dynamic of all those aspects of ourselves that we repress and have decided are wrong and no good, they get projected outwards into the world. And the viciousness with which we do that is kind of in balance with the degree to which we've suppressed it in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the more and we do this in our retreats, we do a lot of shadow work, and on our courses as well. Like, the way to find your shadow is or to a shadow, because we all have many shadows, is to identify your own resentment. Like, so, and one of the examples, I do a guided meditation around this, and one of the examples is, imagine you're sitting on the train and somebody walks on and you just hate that person. They
Right.
haven't said anything. You just hate them. And they make your lip curl, and they're like, oh, they're disgusting. It's like, what is it about them, right? Because they represent something to you that is an aspect of yourself that is kind of unacknowledged and pushed into the basement. But the problem is, as you've just said, is it starts coming out sideways, right? So the process is, it gets sideways in that it gets projected outwards, and it also, you behave like that anyway. And like you're saying, everyone else can see it, but you can't see it, you know? So, and we all do it to different degrees. What's particularly, I think, worrying about like wokeism and the way it plays out in culture is that it's an online simulated religion. And like you said, it's playing out all these dynamics and can't see it, but it also doesn't have the capacity to see it because there's no center to it. It's all happening on like Twitter and Tumblr and Facebook. And all there is there's not even that kind of human connection where you can see your own flaws and see in another their own humanity, which I think has a kind of mitigating effect on how bad the shadow can be.
Well,
It's so much easier.
with the mandated mask, that is coming into the real world now. See, because you have anonymity, so
Yeah.
so online shame culture is starting to trickle because you can hide, and that goes back thousands of years to carnival rituals that ancient societies would do to obscure their identity so that they could have a state of simulated chaos, a state of
Yes.
simulated undifferentiation in which they could do orgies. You could dance around the campfire, and you don't know, the slave could be dancing with the mayor's wife. Masters would be reversed with the slave, where the slave would be, the master would serve the slave. There would be, feasts. So someone brought just a few crackers, the other guy brought lamb roast, and everybody can dive in. That's a state of undifferentiation that normally in a normal society, if you let that go wild, you'd have extinction very quickly. But when you allow that carnival atmosphere, it allows people to lose their better graces, their better sensibilities of restraint, and go wild. And they would always culminate those carnivals, those sacred space times, with a sacrifice. And that's where you see what's happening now is that we can't agree we can't agree who to sacrifice. We can't agree who's the real villain. Is it China? Is it Trump? Is it the deplorables? Is it this group? Is it that group? And then within each group, there's a constant schism. I remember the LGBTQ community, they were doing a parade in New York or somewhere, and they said, we're not going to allow cisgendered drag queens to participate. They're not allowed. If you're a cisgender drag queen, you are excluded from here. And I thought, that's the scapegoat mechanism trying to continually schismatically find a center, like you were saying, and they can't.
Yeah.
Right?
That's very interesting. I really like that. And what comes up for me as you're talking about it is this other quality of, well, the internet, but kind of wokeism in particular, I think, is this non-linearity. There's no beginning, middle, or end. And in the rituals you're talking about, they work, I think, because they are very, just that you have normal running of society, like 99% of the time, and then you have this moment which has a beginning. All ritual has to have a beginning and an end, right? It can't just be flowing continuously because it's madness. So with this kind of non-linear environment of the hyperlinked internet, and there's no center to this, and there's no ability to really agree on anything for very long. Who is it we're after? We don't know. There's that person. No, now it's that person. Now it's that. This kind of constant shifting of the goalposts of what's socially acceptable or not, changing sometimes within hours. Like, this is now not okay. This is now not okay. I think the non-linearity of our world now, and of particularly of being connected to the internet almost all the time through our smartphones and just kind of walking around sort of with one foot in this kind of non-linear mushy space where our identities are fluid. You don't know who's who. It is a kind of saturnalia of whatever. And then as that seeps into the real world, it's like that there is a kind of, I think, a kind of desperate need for order to come into that chaos, right? But I noticed that it, as a worldview, and maybe where we're at culturally, if you use the spiral dynamics, we call it the kind of green, the kind of relativistic postmodern stage of development, it naturally resists things like structure, and critical theory naturally resists anything like order, because that's got to be oppression of some sort. Like it doesn't really unpick them very well. And so, yeah, and I think that's a huge issue because I've seen it play out in like activist communities as well. It's, you know, people gather together for an intention and no one wants to be the person to go, hey, here's the direction I think we should go in. And
And
like, you know,
yeah, and Jesus predicted that would happen. Jesus
mm,
predicted, he said that mother will go against daughter and father will go against all that, because he was basically saying, like, when I unleash my project, what I call the personhood revolution of Jesus, it's
mm,
going to undermine the sacred structures that have been holding societies in relative order with hierarchy and strict differentiation mediated by ritual and sacrifice. And that he's going to open the whole sausage factory of that through history progressively. He says that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It starts very small. Before you know it, it's this massive tree that attracts birds of all types from all over the world. And so it's so tiny at first, and it's like yeast working itself in a loaf. It's a very slow process, but eventually it starts to infect and undermine all structures of culture that were mediated through hidden sacrifice. Now it's all bubbling up. It's all coming to the surface. And so this is a process that Jesus predicts in his own text, that when he talks about separating the sheep from the goats and so forth, right? This notion that, well, who are we doing? Who's being divided in history? It's the ones who care for the least of these, the ones who care for the sick, the naked, the prisoner. That's exactly what wokeism is trying to do. They're scrambling in a fevered dream, playing out a story that Jesus started 2,000 years ago. I mean, when Jesus walked the earth, if you were the least of these, if you were the poorest of the poor, if you went to the theater, you would be lucky if they didn't grab you and throw you in for today's entertainment with wild beasts. And if you were the first, if you were at the top of your hierarchy, you had the best seat in the house as the governor or the Caesar. And today, 2,000 years later, you can see the effects of Christianity in its concern for victims. Because when you go into a theater today, the best seats in the house are reserved for the handicapped, for the people who cannot move, for the people who are maimed or not able to walk or elderly. They're given the best seats where Caesar would have sat in Jesus's time. So his history is unfolding. And because Christianity has a linear view of history, that's why you had the rise of things like Marxism and stuff that wanted to create that heaven on earth, but they wanted to create it through violence, through the revivification of the sacred in the name of the victim. So there's two ways. You have Hitler style. Hitler style is they're trying to start the sacred scapegoat mechanism up by feeding a massive amount of victims to try to recreate that sacred order of hierarchy, and it fails. Then you have Marxism, which is a much more effective strategy, which says we're going somewhere in history, but we're going to do so through sacrificial violence as revenge against those who have benefited from the unfair hierarchies that in the past have been mediated by sacrificial ritual. And of course, by trying to scapegoat the scapegoaters, they end up creating hell on earth instead of a heaven on earth. It's a shortcut to heaven that leads to hell, because that's the mix that Christianity says. It's like you have to love your enemy, you have to forgive 70 times 7, you have to the first shall be last and the last shall be first, but no coercion should be used to do that. That's scary. See, so we're more aware of our victims. We're increasingly becoming aware of our scapegoats, but we're slower to renounce our violence. You see, that's the difference. I think that's the woke problem, right? It's like, yes, you're right. It's good to be aware of our victims, but to try to solve that problem through coercion, which goes back to their logos, which is violence, right? To try to solve that problem ultimately with violence is only going to create more victims. It's only going to create more schisms, and it's not going to create any order that anybody would want to ever be around.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting analysis. And I mean, it just makes me think as well, like one thing that is so difficult about this as a cultural force is that it is talking about something that is and always has been essential, which is the dynamics of power and how we look after those who are disenfranchised in society. I know people from across the political spectrum, and I know very few people who wouldn't say that that's a really very important and noble thing to do. On a deep human level, like when we see suffering, and when we see another human being suffering, wanting to help them is absolutely like for me one of the most human things you can do, right? And so that the way that then plays out in our societies, it's absolutely, of course, key that we find ways to maximize that. Um, but yeah, this is what I like about your analysis. It's like, in order to do that without going into the violence, we have to have that humility, I think. And then again, my question is like, where, because I always like to, like, it's great to analyze stuff, but and I'm not sure how successfully I managed to be empathetic in my article. I had a friend read it who was like, yeah, you could have been more empathetic. And I was like, yeah, fair enough. I think I have my own reactivity around what's playing out. But I'm really genuinely interested in what is the thing, or the, yeah, and this is an open question. I want to be
Right.
really keen to hear your thoughts on it. What is it, or what are some of the things that could take people out of that cycle of blame, shame, violence in the name of representing the oppressed, etc., but into this kind of space of dropping it and coming into a humility and that kind of anger and that kind of desire to find the scapegoat to dissipate? What are some of the things that right now in this time and place where we don't have religion, maybe there's aspects of Christianity that need to come to the fore, but maybe they would have to be expressed in a different way to, say, a critical theory professor who's rabid on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would start with things like you have to have a doctrine of a fall, that universal original sin that runs through the heart of every human being, as Solzhenitsyn said, right? So that's something that we've lost. We don't believe, we think that's antiquated, but I think that's very important. And I think you can actually make a scientific case that there is a universal sin that we're all wrestling with, and that is ritual human sacrifice rests at the very core of all religions, I mean, all cultures that we're familiar with. I mean, if we look, when Jesus says, I am the stone that the builders rejected, and that stone has become the capstone, that's an interesting thing. He's getting that from a Jewish idiom, a saying. And the idea is that when they were building the temple in those days, they would take the irregular shaped stone and they would set it aside because it didn't fit into the groove of their wall, right? And that irregular shaped stone would be the final stone when the project was complete. That would be the capstone, the final stone. But he says also that he's the cornerstone too, which is interesting. So he's not only the final stone, he's also the cornerstone of whatever this project is that he's bringing into history. So the question is, well, what's a cornerstone? What do we learn about cornerstone? Well, it turns out, that cornerstone rituals are found all over the globe. That was what you would do to when we go to there's a new business that's open, right? And they do a ribbon cutting ceremony and it's awkward with the mayor and all this stuff, right? Opening a new donut shop, new whatever. And he comes out, cuts the ribbon. There was a ribbon cutting ceremony for cities and governments, and it was called ritual human sacrifice. Whenever they would start a new village or a new wall or a new temple, they would lay human beings in the cornerstone groove and lay the stone to say, this is the beginning. We're blessing this project. We're blessing this whole thing by giving to our ancestors or gods or spirits, whatever that part of history that they're talking about, that we're giving them a sacrifice. We're sacrificing an other for the good blessing of the new city that we're inaugurating. And Jesus is calling that into mind because he says before when he's going into Jerusalem, he says, remember the crowd is singing, Hosanna, you're our king, you're going to save us. And the religious authorities say, tell these people to be silent. Tell them to shut up. And he says, I tell you, when they are silent, the stones will cry out, right? And when you're in Sunday school, you think, oh, Jesus is being cute. Like this is like a McKenna thing or something, some kind of trippy psychedelic where stones can sing. Yeah, zippity doodah or something, right? But actually what he's talking about is actually a quote from another prophet, Habakkuk 2. And Habakkuk was challenging a wicked king of his time. And he says, woe to you who builds his house on bloodshed and founds his city on murder. The stones cry out within the scaffolding of the wall. And that's referring to that ritual of cornerstone burial sacrifices that were found in Japan, ancient, all over the world. And that's what they're dealing with, is that what he's showing is that if we don't come to grips with the origins, the universal origins of human scapegoating, then we're only going to try in vain to search for a new scapegoat that is deserving of sacrifice, right? And so whatever it is, it's males, or it's America, or it's the West, or whatever, Christianity, capitalism, something has to be the new sacrifice. And because we don't want to have, like you said, the humility to say, wait a second, if I'm doing this, I'm not actually making progress. As irresistible as it feels to want to shame this person, it's not going to make my life better. This is an old ritual, anthropological feature that I'm still playing out. And until we get a reckoning of that as a society, we're not going to escape this nightmare. And that's what Christianity helps us see. It is an anthropological, scientific exposition of human evolution. It's amazing because you can see in the people think like those books are in the Bible are an anthology that let us see the picture of human grasping at how to deal with God and how to deal with our neighbor. And that's why the Bible includes earlier primitive examples of ritual human sacrifice still on the margins, right? That's why you have the story of Abraham and Isaac. That's a story in which it's a revolutionary moment. People think, oh my goodness, it's so nice and noble that, no, actually it's a revolutionary moment, because the idea that a God would demand someone to sacrifice their firstborn was not a new thing. It was a very common thing. So Abraham was just going through the motions, and then the narrator changes and says, no, actually you can kill an animal. You don't have to kill your son. That's a revolutionary challenge to human sacrifice at that point in history. And the Bible includes that in the anthology, so you can see different snapshots of this voice of the victim that's crying out. As they talk about in the New Testament that Abel's blood, Cain is the first character who slaughters Abel, and on his bloodshed he founds the first city. There's that cornerstone ritual sacrifice. And then it says that Jesus's blood cries a better word than Abel. And the reason why is that Abel's blood cries for vengeance. And so when we think about wokeism, we're thinking about Abel's blood. Victims are crying out for vengeance. My ancestors were oppressed. My gender is oppressed. There is rape going on. Whatever it is, there is a vengeance. I must have power. Someone must pay. But Jesus's blood speaks a better word. He says, forgive the oppressor. And that's a very difficult thing, and we have a hard time dealing with that. It's very futuristic. Christianity is not something we're leaving. We're barely even getting close to trying it.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Really well. It's a new lens. It's a new lens for me to think in those terms, like, and especially in those historical terms, and the idea of Christianity being something continuing, and when you were talking, what really something that came up for me was the relationship between shame and violence, right? Because I've been toying with the nature of shame as it relates to wokeism, because one of my friends who read the Sleeping Woke piece was saying that another aspect to look at is about religion is the practices they're using. And he was like, what practices is wokeism using? I was like, that's a good question. And over the last few days, I've been thinking about it. And the sensitivity trainings and white fragility kind of as a concept of self-flagellation and dealing with one's own shame for the responsibility like that original sin has gone into post-colonialism. It's like, I watched this, it was fascinating. I watched this TED talk. I can't remember what it was now, but it was about decolonization, which is a big term in critical theory now, right? And the woman said in this, she was like the history of colonization and colonialism that white people have been a part of, and many other cultures as well. But she was speaking specifically about, like, let's say people in Canada and the US, etc., and of course Europe. She was like, it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. And I was like, and she didn't really go into what the difference between those two things were to a degree that I felt made sense. And I was like, what an interesting framing, because what is the perceived difference between those two things, and where does shame come into it? Because it seemed what she was calling for was, you didn't do it, but you bear shame for it. Or if you're not feeling the shame for it, you're not truly awake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the impossibility, though, of that world, like, I'm all for recognizing the impact of the past. I'm half German. And so, I kind of, I often think about what my ancestors did, and think of, I don't feel personally responsible for it, but I feel a spiritual urge to be especially aware of what we're capable of as people,
Mm-hmm.
and to not forget, and that doesn't, there's a nuance there of awareness and awakeness, and a kind of, again, this kind of simulated wokeness, that I'm woke, I'm aware of my role as an oppressor, and I'm aware of the microaggressions I commit simply by being alive and by glancing at someone the wrong way, or using the wrong tonality at the end of a sentence, and all of that. There's something very profound going on, but twisted the wrong way, around the dealing with shame. And a lot of people have pointed out that so many of the most vocal voices, um, speaking ostensibly on behalf of minorities, are fairly well-educated and privileged white people. And it seems like there's two things going on. There's the genuine problems that people are facing, and kind of hitting up against systemic barriers, and there's issues in the society, and like the degree to which they're there is I think needs healthy debate, etc. But there's a lot of lived experience of really bad situations that should be heard, I think, and really engaged with fully. And then there's this other strand of people using that as a kind of ritualized, I don't know, some kind of ritualized shame process, which then turns into violence very quickly. Because it seems like the shame rarely gets, like Robin DiAngelo and kind of her white fragility message, it doesn't really give, it's a Kafka trap. It doesn't really give an out to the shame. It doesn't allow for any kind of, there's certainly, there's no sense of moving beyond the scapegoating,
Yeah.
and there's no sense of, as soon as we kill these people, it'll be fine. Probably she would be more psychologically healthy if she just went there and was like, yeah, what we need to do is wipe out these people. And it would probably be, I'm not sure, I guess I know who it would be for her, but it seems that there's some kind of stuckness around dealing with shame. I think that's the point I'm getting to. And that's turning into violence. So I'm keen to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Christianity, that's the thing. Christianity is the thing. It's not about keeping shame. It's about repentance and forgiveness. It's about unconditional love.
Yeah.
And so without that humility to go for that, you're going to get a shame-filled hell on earth. It's going to be awful. Because like you were saying, they're trying to self-flagellate, but it's always a convenient self-justification, because it's all about, well, it's not me deeply at my core. That's the problem. It's just that I happen to be a certain skin tone.
I lost you there, David.
Can you hear me? How about now? Are you hearing me? Is that good?
You're back.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I got all of it though. It went fast motion to what I missed.
So yeah, all I'm saying is that the idea about Christianity is that everyone at their core has a fallen tendency, right? But that you don't stay in that shame, that there's this unconditional love that the Creator has for you, and that it's manifest when we show that love to those who hurt us, when we show that love and we create mimetic role models of positive forgiveness and mercy and grace and nonviolence. It's so important. Nonviolence is critical to all of this. And that's why the church has failed in history at times, because it's a slow process. When Christianity comes onto the scene, it's not like we fully divest ourselves of the mythic sacred that day. It's a process. That's why it's that yeast metaphor. Ideologies promise overnight Marxist revolutions and stuff. Christianity doesn't say that. It's going to be a yeast. It's going to be a slow process. And it's going to be a radical choice as to whether human beings get it right or get it wrong, and how quickly they get it right. And that's a slow evolutionary process that we can actually trace by looking at texts, the same way we look at fossil records. So we see the fossil record of a transitionary species through the different strata, right? We see the same thing when you look at texts with an anthropological framework. You can see the intelligence of the victim start to reveal the way text is in its recount of events in history. I'll give you an example. When you read a story let's say during the medieval ages, or 1500s, go into that period even, and you hear about a plague, and they say, look, we found out it was the Jews, they poisoned the river, and therefore we dealt with the Jews, and therefore the plague averted itself, right? We automatically know, if that text is written in 1500, whatever, or 1600s, we automatically know to be suspicious of the narrator, right? We know. That's Christianity that gave us that intelligence. We know to be skeptical of that narrator, even if that narrator at the time thought he was a Christian or whatever, right? Now, go back farther in time, and things get a little bit more murky when we go to like Oedipus Rex, and it says there was a plague, and it turned out that this king had incest and parricide. We don't even bother to question that accusation. We assume that he really is, and to the point where we've created an entire psychology field around the Oedipal complex. We're still scapegoating. We're still hiding the victim of our origins, right? So the farther back you go in history, the more we hide the mythic violence that's still there. So it's interesting. We give mythology a pass. We say, oh, no, mythology is just creative, superstitious, dreams and archetypes, and it's all just trying to make sense of values and crops and cycles of seasons. No. It's hiding murder, ultimately, because that's the thing that bound us together. The word religion means to bind us together. What binds us together other than when we're caught up in imitation that's going afoul? There has to be a way. That's where it's so important. There has to be a way to channel that anger into a safe direction, so as to not create a war of all against all. With wolves, when a dominant wolf beats another wolf, that wolf that loses presents its neck to the victor. And usually the wolf who wins does not go for the strike, because the dominant submission mechanism has worked. But humans are not the same. We are hyper mimetic. That's why we can do language. That's why we build tools. The wolves don't have tools like we do. They don't have the kind of things that we do, because we have a super brain that's so good about mimesis. We can imitate like the masters of the species of the world. And so what happens with that? What happens is, if I kill, if unlike wolves, where they respect the dominant submission hierarchy alone, we are reciprocal to a point of vendetta. So if I kill your friend, you kill my whole family, and then whoever's left in my village goes to war against your village. And whoever's left from that goes to war against my country, and we have these things going on for hundreds and thousands of years. So there has to be an explanation for why humans, being so mimetic as we are still around. And that's why it's tied and correlated to the data that the societies that did not practice ritual cannibalism went extinct. See what I mean? So if they didn't stumble unconsciously onto a scapegoat mechanism, they tore each other apart. It's the societies that found ritual cannibalism and ritual human sacrifice that starts off as a spontaneous psychological crowd phenomenon. That's not, you're not, when we talk about stumbling onto the scapegoat mechanism, we don't mean that, like it's not like people conspire, hey, let's kill the witch. It's more like you're in a state of undifferentiation. You're in a state of bad blood. And in that moment where you're imitating each other and it looks like you're losing your sense of self, anyone who stands out arbitrarily with some kind of difference, hunchback, a witch, too pretty, too ugly, too poor, someone that's usually not able to get revenge, there's not a lot of folks going to have their side, boom, the killing goes on, and we say, you know what, I feel a lot better. I used to hate you, Bill, but now I know it was that witch that got us all stirred up. She's done. We ate her, we killed her, we threw her off of a whatever cliff. We're happy now. I feel great. That's the catharsis that we get when we watch movies today. But they got it on such a visceral level that they remembered that event every time they had a social crisis throughout the ages. That was an oral tradition. That's why all the founding myths talk about gods being dismembered, and out of that dismembering comes order. Out of that comes the sea. Out of that comes the humans and these things. The whole hierarchy is mediated through some kind of cartoonish violence.
Yeah.
And so our modern scholars, they think they're not religious, but they are religious. They're hiding the sacred unintentionally. They're unintentionally, because they want to avoid the truth. things hidden since the foundation of the world. So they unconsciously say, well, mythology is just cartoonish stuff. But then when we get to the Middle Ages, where we see Christians persecuting, oh, that's really evil. That was wicked. That was terrible. That was a conspiracy. And it was. But they're only able to see that precisely because Christianity was breaking down the mythic structures of the text so that you can see it more clearly. See what I mean? When you go back
absolutely.
when you go back to Marduk, it's more hidden within the symbols. So Marduk breaks wind or something, and all of a sudden another god does this, and you're like, what is this? This is so cartoonish. But it's a concealment of the violence that's more intact. When Christianity comes, it starts to deconstruct it. And before you know it, when modern eyes read these more recent texts, we can more clearly see, no, the Jews didn't do that. This is a piece of history, but it's an unreliable narrator, and I must renounce the narrator's perspective in order to come to the truth. That's something that Judeo-Christianity gave to the world. And the reason why you're right that we keep quarantining the thing onto gender or race or whatever is because as we become aware of our victims, we want to scapegoat our more recent ancestors, right? It's like there's this delayed effect. It's like you become aware of scapegoating, but you're most aware to the most recent examples of your most contemporary history. That's why we're super sensitive about the things that we have done wrong in more recent times, like segregation and slavery, right? And the subjugation of women, and then witch trials and things like that. It's all this. So Christianity kind of destroys its own foundation, right? Because as it gives us the ability to see through the scapegoating of our recent history, it starts to make us hate. And we start to scapegoat Christianity and say, well, the reason we did those things was because of capitalism, because of patriarchy, because of Christianity, not because human nature did this back in the days of Marduk. You see? Because if you see that, then you cannot create a consensus to scapegoat people based on any kind of difference.
Yeah. And I mean, as you're talking, I'm just stuck with this metaphor of the bearing of the neck, right?
Right.
And breaking the cycle, like like the story of Jesus, really, like breaking that cycle through sacrifice and through allowing yourself to be like, okay, like that. I'm really curious about how this whole kind of cancel culture argument is playing out, because you have the kind of the wokeism rising up, and then you have the counterforce as a kind of let's try and argue against this using a kind of liberal values of free speech. And it doesn't work at all, right? This is completely pointless. And the aikido move, actually I had that phrase in the
I love that word.
essay.
I use that word too about Jesus.
So the aikido move for me would be like, what does it look like when we're just like lovingly like, hey, cool, cancel me, okay, like that kind of like the energy of that, and how it actually works or might play out in different situations is different, but not fighting it, and breaking that cycle. Because I think from looking at the critical theory roots of wokeism, it is asking for opposition from linear narrative. It's looking for that, and it is expert at taking it and twisting it, because that's what it's built on. It's built in opposition to that, right? It's an oppositional religion or simulated religion. And so the more people feed it, the worse it is. And so it's like, hey, why not just break the cycle and with a kind of loving kindness be like, all right, great, go for it, and see what happens. If it happened en masse, if a lot of people did it, and I've heard like a few people being like, coming at this from a kind of like, screw it, just like come at me kind of thing. But it's all about the attitude. It's the how, not the what. I think it's very much the attitude with which it's done. And I think that could at least create an opening for a new kind of conversation of that as a mimetic force of a kind of neck bearing openness, and kind of like, hey, let's break this psychodrama that's going on. Let's have a pause in it, because it requires all of us to play the victim perpetrator and scapegoat kind of, is that the triumvirate or am I taking a different one from Rene Girard? Is it those three? Because
Well,
there's also a
no,
Jungian version.
the triangular nature is for desire. Like you
Yeah,
desire your model's desire, and the object
that
of
was
your
it.
model's desire is actually evaporates at some point, because when you're it's like when
Mm-hmm.
you see two kids, right? They're fighting over a toy, toddlers,
Mm,
you know,
mm.
and there could be two of that same exact doll in the playpen, right? But whatever the one grabs, the other one wants it immediately, and they start pooling, tug of war. The first one that picked up the toy didn't really care about the toy, but now that the other one's grabbing, now he really wants it. He's like, well, no, that's mine.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
what
yeah,
he's talking about, that triangular nature. The object is the
yeah,
inciting incident, but it's actually the neighbor that you want to be one with. So you're
yeah.
copying the neighbor, and the object is like the incident that starts it, but eventually kind of fades out of view. Like
Yes.
two kids in a high school fighting over a girl. Before you know it, they're fighting, and the girl's like moved on and dating somebody else. In the process, it's like, wait a second, we're just fighting for being obsessed with each other now. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? It's about one-upmanship. It's that mimetic wiring that we have that, if left unchecked, would destroy our whole civilization. We'd be
yeah,
extinguished. And so
yeah.
it's because the scapegoat mechanism, we were able to, well, think about it, if we're all if desire is contagious, and then we start to get scarce resources, so now that desire is more aggressive. Now it's more acquisitive in a hungrier way. And
Mm.
now you've got people pointing fingers left and right. It's just just kind of how it feels right now. Have you noticed how
Yeah,
it feels right now?
yeah, 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 yeah,
So you've got
absolutely.
that at a more tribal primal level, and they're all pointing each other's fingers. So they're locked in a mimetic reciprocal feedback loop right now. How are
Yes,
you going to stop
yes.
that? What's going to happen is someone who looks arbitrarily different, or somehow is all of a sudden they're imitating in one direction. See?
Hmm.
It's usually like a prevailing act. It's a prevailing scandal that's taking place. So it's like, I think of it at a high school cafeteria again. That scandal starts off local, but then the whole group sides with one of those guys in that
Yeah,
feud, and the other guy gets scapegoated. See what I mean?
yeah,
They
yeah, yeah, yeah.
buy into his accusation spirit against that rival. That's why Oedipus, he had a rival, but you never remember that guy's name. You just remember Oedipus, the scapegoat, who says, hey, I'm going to blot out my eyes because I'm guilty of everything the crowds accuse me of, and I'm going to go ahead and leave the city, and then the plague's going to go away. How's that sound? They say,
Mm.
yay! And we're like, oh, wow, that's a nice little metaphorical story. Let's make a psychological field about it. No, it was a sacred violence. Go
Yeah.
look at the top of the mountain where Zeus was born in Greece. You'll
Mm.
see the bones, literally, of a teenage boy ritually sacrificed. That's God. That's Zeus. We
Yeah.
don't we don't create gods. We deify our victims. That's what Rene Girard was keen about teaching us. We
Mm.
deify our victims, and that's what wokeism is doing.
Yes.
It's trying to deify people's external identity markers because of their perceived oppression in the hierarchical structures of our history. So you're
Mm.
deified. Now you're sacred. Now, as long as you follow the ideology. Now, if you deviate, you can be a person of color or anything, and they will mock you. Look what they did to this recent woman, Dr. Emmanuel, Stella Emanuel,
Mm.
the African-American woman who was talking about hydroxychloroquine, and they've eliminated her on every video. Have you heard
Mm.
about this?
No, no, I
It's
haven't.
all over. It was been all over the place. She did a conference in the front of the Supreme Court, and she said that she has treated 350 patients as a ER doctor for
Hmm.
COVID using these generic drugs, azithromycin, hydroxychloroquine, and zinc. And Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter have been deleting that video everywhere. Now, this woman is an immigrant from Africa, and they found her. She has her own ministry where she talks about demons and some kind of weird stuff. And so they've been using that. You'll see hashtag Twitter making fun of her claims about demon possession and stuff like that, and to
Mm.
discredit her for saying things about these generic drugs that big pharma can't make a lot of money with. And so it's just interesting to see how, if you deviate from the party line,
Yeah.
they can fetishize a woman because she's an immigrant. They can try to make her. You can see the tone. You'll see it on leftist Twitter that
Mm.
you can tell that they're mocking her, like she's got witch doctor views or something. She's a
Mm.
superstitious rube, and they're trying to hang it on to Trump and all that. But you can just see that with this wokeism group, your external identity markers are not enough. You must adhere to the unity of thought,
Yeah.
and it's always being changed. You know what I mean? So you have to always upgrade, like AOL in the mail. Did you ever get those AOL CDs?
Oh
Or
yeah,
no?
yeah,
No, you were in
way
England though.
back in the.
But you
No, I
didn't. You
was
were
in Germany. We had
okay.
them. We had these. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, you had to upgrade it all the time. That's what wokeism. You got
yeah,
to upgrade your language like every 4 months, or else you're going to be
yeah,
scapegoated. So it's a terrible, stressful religion. It's terrible.
yeah, yeah. And there's an addictive quality to that, because it's like Gabor Mate wrote a great book called The Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and the hungry ghosts come from this Tibetan Buddhist conception of kind of like the underworld, and like it's one of the layers of kind of like a layer of hell. It's like these people who are kind of never satisfied because they're trying to kind of feed an insatiable hunger, and I think that there's an element of that in wokeism, where it's like nothing can be pure enough because none of it's really scratching the itch that's there. It's
Mm-hmm.
all a kind of mimicry of wholeness, and there's a kind of quest for justice, and there's a quest for the world to be this kind of utopian quest for fairness. But I think it's actually a quest for freedom and connection, what we're always like kind of looking for: spiritual freedom, connection. And because of that linguistic, let's say, the cycles it's stuck in, the psychodramas it's stuck in that are playing out, it's what I guess Vervaeke's talked about, reciprocal narrowing as it relates to addiction. You get in this cognitive loop that gets more and more and more and more rigid, and then awakening is reciprocal opening, where you get more and more and more and more awake, and salient, and everything expands. They're in this kind of reciprocal self-destructive narrowing, and like so many really extreme belief systems, it's inevitable. Like no matter how pure you are, you're always looking over your shoulder,
Yeah.
but the group of the pure gets smaller and smaller until presumably it's such a hardcore
But it
group
would.
that it burns itself out in some
Yeah,
way.
yeah. They'll never get along, because like I saw that the 1619 Project lady, she was talking about how Native Americans need to be recognizing the fact that they own slaves. And then a Native
Mm,
American activist said, "No, you guys have been trying to extinguish our voice from the record." And there was like this big fight about who is the more victim here, the Native Americans or the African American. And so that was the big fight. And I
yeah,
looked at that and I thought to myself, okay, well, that's mimetic rivalry. So their object that they're fighting over is who has supreme victim status, right?
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
object that they're imitating each other for. But how are they going to resolve that? Remember, because if you left desire unchecked, it won't function. It will create violence and chaos. So their scapegoat that binds them together is their attack against people who don't follow woke ideology at all, right? That's the unifying scapegoat. It's everybody who's not on board with their project. But because it's not a lasting and unifying cathartic scapegoat, it won't work. And so they will continue to fly apart, and they will scapegoat each other and try to destroy each other and banish each other's projects and create. And each new schism will take on the identity of the differentiating factor that they felt make them perceived victims of the original victim. So every new schism identity will take on that identity of whatever it is that made them different from the rest of the super victim group that they came from. And that would just keep going in perpetuity, because Christ was crucified outside the camp. So they're going to psychologically replay that trauma over and over again, of being the idea that the sacred, that God's presence himself, the ultimate good of a society, is found outside the camp, outside of the Holy of Holy temple, found outside in the trash dump. And so everything you see within victimist culture in the West will pattern that same being cast outside in order to find one's true sacred identity. You see what I mean? They will always be coveting the martyr's perch of the cross, and every group that breaks away will create its identity based on that perceived cross perch that they're on outside the camp. That the victim group that they were in was not sufficiently victim conscious enough to allow their particular victim status to be seen as sacred. And so they feel that they have to be excommunicated. And in that excommunication, in that exclusion, there is sacredness. It's a pale imitation of the Christian story.
Yeah.
They're just playing out that nightmare, because it is a nightmare as long as you don't repent of violence. So that's the key. The thing I would like to leave away is just think about we have to create a protection of human persons. That's my advice, right? The most ultimate minority of all is the human person. So if we don't protect the human person, if we don't treat, and I'm not saying individualism, right? I'm saying human persons. If we don't protect human persons from collectivism in all of its forms, then this thing will continue to spiral out of control. That's what I think is the uniting message that we should try to present to folks, which is like my example. I believe no victim, no crime. I believe every human being who's in a prison cage for a nonviolent crime, whatever it is, should be set free, right? That's a unifying message that cuts across all race, gender, everything, because you're protecting the most vulnerable minority that Christianity puts at the fulcrum of history, which is the human person. And I think as long as we think of things as protecting the human person, we'll be less likely to fall into scapegoating, violence, and justification of dehumanizing people.
Yeah. For me, it's the sacredness of the individual, because because that movement away from the fixation on group identity, determining like that kind of confusion of like your group identity is what then pours into your individuality, like this very postmodern idea. I think that's incredibly toxic, and what it doesn't allow for is an essential kind of sacred core. And in fact, essentialism is the great enemy of critical theory. People get accused of essentialism. So there's a natural, and they have their reasons for that on a critical level, but I think there's a much deeper level of it, is that if you allow that there are essential truths and there are things that are essentially at the core of things, then you start getting in the territory of, well, maybe human beings have an essential core to them as well, and they can't just be defined by what group they're in. And
Exactly.
if that is true, which it is, then the entire project falls apart in its current form.
Yeah, and that means that we have to radically rethink the scope and the size and power of the state, because the state is the vestige of that sacred violence machine, the scapegoat mechanism, and what we see in America right now is you're seeing a twilight of American gods. You're seeing the Americana state, the state of America, the nation state battling this new wokeism god. These are gods fighting, right? America is what binds us together. That was a religion that worked for a time, but now it's falling apart because wokeism is challenging their mythology. Wokeism is saying your founding myth is a lie, just like Jesus says all founding myths are a lie. But they just quarantine it onto America because they don't want to. They don't want to see the universal scapegoat mechanism at the core of all humans. So they're saying, no, the American founders were not genius men. They were conspirators trying to subjugate and create genocide. So they're trying to rewrite the founding myth that makes our American God, the nation state, stay alive. And that's what's happening. You're having a war of two false gods. And the Christian story is to be the peace mediator that comes in the midst of that and says, hey, all these gods are a lie. They're all hiding you from your ability to renounce the scapegoat mechanism and to love each other as human persons and to never justify using violence against any neighbor, even through the voting booth, even through jury participation. It's like we still have these rituals. If I'm on a jury and they're going to send this man away for 50 years for crack, well, I'm not doing it to him. Yeah, you're guilty. No, that's violence. You're still doing it. You're still throwing a stone against everybody else as they're throwing a stone. And that's something that Christians help us see. Christianity helps us see. But the problem is it's a radically free will religion, and it requires people to actually do it. And that's scary because nobody wants to be Jesus crucified on a cross. So that's the hard part we're in.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, a lot of food for thought. Really.
Well, hey, I really
this.
appreciate your time, Alexander. It's been a pleasure, and I really enjoy your work. I want to keep highlighting your articles and the videos you guys put out at Rebel Wisdom. Anything else you'd like to highlight to people? Anything else going on?
No. I think people can check out Rebel Wisdom on YouTube and Medium, etc. We're just we're constantly doing stuff. It's always changing. But no, that's pretty much it. Lots coming up, and I really enjoyed this. I really really fascinating perspective. I knew a little bit about Gerard, and just hearing you kind of go into the specifics as well has given me a really useful framing, I think. So I think it's I'm looking forward to hopefully staying in touch and bouncing ideas off each other as and when.
Well, very good. You have a great one. Take care.
You too. Take care.